Hi, guys. Welcome back to Beyond the Sessions. One of the things I put on my story the other day, I asked you guys to ask me some questions. And one of the questions I thought would be really important for me to answer this early on into the pod is my thoughts on therapy. Like, why am I a therapist? What do I believe about therapy? I often hear people say to me, like, is it just talking about your feelings? And like, what's the point? Like, if I already know what's happened in my life, what's the point? And I just want to say, firstly, I was the biggest therapy skeptic ever. Like, I don't think anyone understands. When I started training as a therapist, I was the type of person who was like, well, why would I be emotional? Like, my feedback for my whole second year of my training was always, you're far too logical, you're far too cognitive, you're far too in your head about things. You need to feel more. That was the constant feedback. Keep feeling your feelings. And I was like, guys, why am I feeling my feelings? And my lecturer would just say, well, trust the process. And I thought, you're not giving me an answer. Like, I am someone, I love maths. When I was younger, I loved maths, maybe a bit too much. Like, when I learned how to do algebra, this is so nerdy, but when I learned how to do algebra, I would go home and create new algebra equations for myself. Not like Pythagoras, like discovering things. I'd just be like, 1x plus 4x equals, and I would do the maths. I would create homework for myself just because I love when something is formulaic. I love when something is systematic. Like, I love understanding things. I love my mind, not my mind personally, but I love the mind. And so when I first started training as a therapist, I thought, oh yeah, I'm gonna learn the human psyche. And then to my shock, so much of it was like, well, how do you feel? Talk about your feelings. And I thought, what the heck are we doing here? I don't want to talk about my feelings. And so I always find it funny when people assume that I am like the biggest therapy advocate, the biggest feelings advocate. Of course I am. But when people say things to me like, oh, well, doesn't it just keep people victims? I think, oh, I wish they knew that that's also where I started out. I started out so critical of therapy, so resistant to therapy. You guys have heard me reference my old therapist, Oscar, so much. And part of the reason I referenced him is because he met me when I was deep in my skepticism. And I actually think that's really hard to work with someone who's like, this is pointless. Like, why are you asking me to talk about my feelings? Or he'd like say things because I was very cognitive. And so if I would bring something up, I might say, oh, well, Oscar, I had a really um, long day at work today, and my boss said this, my boss did that. And he'd be like, so it sounds like you're angry. And I'd be like, well, I didn't say anger, actually. I just said this happened. He'd be like, so I know there's anger here. And I'd be like, why are you trying to make me feel things? Like, I'm not actually feeling that. And now, as a therapist, I know that he was picking up on emotions that I was not aware of. And I know the importance of being able to name your feelings and trust the process and feel your feelings. Like, that's something I think a lot of us don't do. We're so quick to intellectualize, which was like my pastime at that point. I was so good at observing my life and just processing it. Why? Because I didn't actually have the tools to process my emotions. I was never really taught to regulate my emotions. I was never really taught to name my emotions. Like, if we want to talk about something, let's talk about emotional literacy. Do you label your emotions correctly? I have so many people come into the therapy room and tell me, I'm anxious. And I ask them, what does anxious look like to you? And they will describe a variety of things. In fact, one person who I worked with years ago now, they were 10, so I'll give them the benefit of the doubt. But she said to me, I'm anxious. And that means when I don't want to do something, I don't do it. And I said, ooh, honey, I don't think that's what anxious means. But bless her, that was her definition. And so for me, I knew I also had that problem. Like, I knew that I didn't know how to name my feelings. Like, if you asked me how I was either fine, okay, good. Like, there was nothing really else I could label. And I definitely didn't know how to feel my emotions. I could feel joy. I loved feeling happy. Sadness, not really. In fact, when I was younger, I hated listening to slow songs because I was like, these things are making me sad. Why would I want to feel sad? But I was just suppressing my feelings, and I was quite robotic. And so shout out to Oscar because he dealt with a very cognitive, logical version of me. And so that's where I started in my own therapy journey. Biggest skeptic, the biggest like denier of therapy. Maybe it sounds like I'm a conspiracy theorist, but I really just I did not buy it. I don't even know how I ended up training to be a therapist. Like, I knew I was interested in psychology, but like I said, I don't think I knew what I was really signing up for. Um, and so part of my journey into now being a therapist and having done it for so long has been learning the importance of feelings and what therapy actually does. And so let's talk about that. What is my opinion on therapy? Because every therapist has completely different perspective on it. They might be trained with different modalities in therapy. And so how they approach it is different. And so let's talk about if you were to work with me. Uh, Usually, what therapy looks like is you will find a therapist. Maybe you'll go on a directory of sorts. In the UK, we have counseling directory, we have psychology today, we have the BACP website, which is like the counseling body that's my membership, but there's also other counseling sort of memberships that therapists and counselors can have. And so you might go on that website, you might look for a counselor or a therapist, you might type in anxiety. So you'll look for someone who works with anxiety, or you might type in your area or if you want to work online. Anyway, you find your therapist. Once you find your therapist, you usually have an initial session of sorts. Sometimes it's 20 minutes, sometimes it's slightly longer, depending on how the person trained. Sometimes it's an hour, sometimes it's paid for, sometimes it's free, depending on the therapist. But for me, when I usually have people come in for an initial session, I will usually tell them the same thing. So if you're one of my clients, you know you've heard this speech at some point. I would say the initial session is a really helpful time for you to figure out, do you want to work with me? Like you can fully get a bit of a taste of what working with me would look like. Because actually, scientifically, the best type of therapy, the most beneficial therapy, the therapy that is most likely to work is nothing to do with modality and everything to do with relationship to the therapist. And so usually I say to people, this is a bit of a time, it's a bit like a first date. It's a bit awkward. We're new to each other, but you're figuring out, is that my vibe? Is she my vibe? And I'm figuring out, can I actually work with you? Because perhaps I might not work with the thing that you're saying. You know, if you come in and you've been through a certain level of trauma, I might say, well, actually, I might not be taking on people who have been through uh complex trauma. I might say, oh, well, see this person, or I recommend this modality because of what your experience is. And so it's a bit like a first date, a little bit awkward. And I always say to people, it's the opportunity for me to figure out why you feel you either need or want therapy because everyone comes for a different reason. And so in that time, I usually do it for about 20 to 30 minutes. In that time, I'll often ask people, what's brought you here? What do you think's going on for you? I ask them to explain perhaps like I said earlier, what does anxiety mean to you? When you tell me that's how you're feeling, what does that look like? I'll also ask, so what's your goal? If we were to create this perfect version of you in 6 months, what would that person be doing? How would they be and how would it be different from now? And so if someone comes in and they've just recently gone through a divorce, they might want them in 6 months to be someone who's more confident, who feels able to regulate their emotions, doesn't feel as distressed or distraught anymore. Perhaps they might want the confidence to date again, or maybe they'll even have a physical goal of, in my marriage, maybe I gained loads of weight and now I want to start losing some of that weight. And though I'm not a personal trainer, so much of our body and our body image is also mental, right? And so it can come up in therapy. And so the initial session is time where I hear more about their story, but also they can ask me questions, like, oh, what modality do you practice? What does a typical session look like? We can also have very practical conversations for like cost, um, when we're going to schedule our sessions, etc., etc. And so usually the initial session is where we get the background. And then you begin your therapy if you choose to go forward. And I always love the initial because it gives a bit of a great picture of what is going on for people. Sometimes people come in and because they've been holding so much, the initial session is the time where they just release it all and they just cry. Um, because they've just been trying to contain things and they finally have a space to express. And sometimes people come in and maybe their partner has brought them to the therapy room and I can tell they don't really want to be there. I'm thinking, I don't want you to feel like you have to come here, or maybe their parents brought them into therapy with me. Regardless, that's usually what therapy looks like. And then you begin, I guess, your course of treatment, your therapy sessions. But one of the things that people often ask me is, does therapy just keep you a victim? Like in the initial session, I sometimes get people say, "Oh, why do you want me to go back to what happened?" And it's not that I'm asking you what happened when you were 3 years old and 5 years old. That's often not what I'm asking. But someone might bring up a theme and they might say, "Oh, I people please." Why could I not say that? I people please. They might say, "I people please." I'll say, "Okay, tell me about your relationship to people pleasing. How long have you been doing that for? When did it start?" I'll just ask some questions. And even me asking them to go back further than the present day, sometimes I'm met with a level of resistance. And I think for some people, that resistance is they don't necessarily want to reflect on their story. They don't necessarily want to go back to the traumatic events that happened. They've spent most of their life not reflecting on that. And so they don't want to do that in an initial session. For some people, um, it's the opposite, where they love telling me from day dot to now. They really want to spend time, and those people are sometimes prone to rumination. They really feel like they have a lot they still need to deal with. But I sometimes meet people who, when I will ask them to explore something and maybe go back in their timeline just so I can have a better picture, they feel resistant because they have a fear that I want them to become this perpetual victim and I want them to wallow. And I think this is one of the therapy myths that I see online. Like, therapy is just making people wallow in their sadness, and you need to move on and you need to move forward. And here's where I have grace and compassion. I agree. I don't think any of my clients should ever become professional victims. In fact, in the initial session, I always say to them, you might think I'm nice in this session and you might think I am so like sweet and bubbly. But actually, there will be times if you choose to do therapy where I will say things and you won't interpret them as nice. It's not that I'm intentionally being mean to you, but I might say something to you and it might trigger you. Or I might say something to you and it might feel like I'm being critical. And I might not be, but it might feel that way. And I think we live in a time where people are so resistant to doing things that feel like they are hard. That I think people are really resistant to even exploring some of their triggers and working through them, like the trigger warning thing. I totally understand that some things require a trigger warning. If it is something gruesome, if it is something quite violent, I think 100% let's put a trigger warning over it. But actually, I often ask myself, how much does trigger warning just serve as a level of avoidance? Like, there will be times in life where people cannot abide by your trigger warnings because they might not know your story. And I think we need to be able to build up a level of resilience to the things that are triggering to us, not completely feel nothing. Like, I'm not asking for you to deny your feelings, but I would encourage anyone I work with, at least, is to push past what feels uncomfortable, because I think the healing's often on the other side of discomfort. I also think freedom's often on the other side of discomfort. And so I always say to people, you might think I'm nice, but there'll be times where you probably don't think I'm nice. But that's part of the journey. We need to do some of the hard, nitty gritty stuff in order to truly heal. And so I agree with people. I would never want any of my clients to be perpetual victims. And in fact, sometimes when clients come in and I can tell they love that they have um, played a certain role in people's lives, if a client comes in and they are always telling me about how everyone treats them a certain way, at some point I do ask them, what do you think you do that means that every single person you come into contact with treats you that way? Like, is there something that you are putting out there that is making them all see you in one way? For example, if I work with someone and they are really promiscuous, they are constantly sleeping with people. Hey, do what you want. If it's safe, I totally understand. Do what you've got to do. But if you then come into therapy and you say to me, oh, everyone treats me and uses me for my body, what I then will ask is, well, are you offering your body quite soon? Because if you offer that up so soon, they might assume that that's all you want from that. And it might not even be them using you, but it might be what they think you want as well. The same way, I sometimes get men in therapy saying, well, women just want me for my money. And again, I have to ask them, how much are you spending on these women? If every woman in your life is using you for your money, I think you need to start gatekeeping your money a bit. They shouldn't feel the need to have access to that, nor should they actually have access. And often when I explore it, people are giving people access to things that they don't necessarily need. And again, that's not to say that at times abuses of power don't occur. Of course they do. Of course, at times you end up in relationships with people who are manipulative or who do really awful things. But I am all about accountability. And it's important for us to reflect on what we do that might be causing the things that we're complaining about in our own lives. And so no one in my therapy room, I hope, should feel like they are comfortable in their victimhood. I can acknowledge the truth of what happened to you while also acknowledging that you are no longer in that space. And what we want to do in therapy is heal mentally from that space, because we hold on to where we were. When we haven't processed our hurt, perhaps this is a better way of explaining it. When we haven't processed what we've been through, when we haven't allowed ourselves to feel what where what we've experienced or where we've been, at times we can feel stuck in that. We can feel quite regressed in that. And the therapy journey, part of it is to heal from that place. So you are no longer living in the past. You can now live in the present. One of my favorite questions to ask my clients, and it's one I hated when I was a client. One of my favorite questions to ask my client is, how old is this emotion you're feeling right now? Or how old is this thought? Let me give an example. Maybe I'll give an example from when I was sick a few months ago. So I had tonsillitis and chest infections just back to back for a good 3-ish months. And during that time, I remember thinking, oh, I just want to be taken care of. Like, I just want someone to make me dinner and run me a bath and all this stuff. And I just really wanted care. I don't know, I just really wanted it. And I asked myself when I was journaling one day, I thought, how old is this thought? Because I was acting like a child. Not that being taken care of is childish, that's not what I'm saying. But I personally was definitely acting like a child. I was like, oh, I can't do anything. I think even the way I was speaking was slightly more whiny and regressed. And I think that can happen for a lot of us. Like sometimes, though we are in an adult body, our thoughts or our feelings are actually the thoughts and feelings of someone who's 10 years old or someone who's 15. And perhaps that's because something may have occurred or not occurred at that age. You know, when I say something didn't occur, it's not to say nothing happened, but sometimes the thing we need to heal from isn't the big traumatic event that happened. It's the fact that our needs weren't necessarily met. And so that didn't happen and it should have happened. And for me, it was a sort of similar thing. I have this story, it's so vivid in my story. I remember, trigger warning for anyone who feels a bit squeamish and doesn't like the idea of like vomit or sick. So, like, please skip over a minute. Um, but I remember when I was younger, and there was a day where I was sick, like physically sick, and I wasn't sick often. Um, but I remember there was a day I was sick because when I was younger, I used to have this irrational fear of deep water. I say it's irrational, but when I was younger, my mum had like old shark movies that she used to love watching. I don't know what it was, but she loved Jaws and any movie about sharks and deep water. And I watched them quite young with her, but it just put the fear of deep water. It just instilled that into me. And unfortunately, anytime I would be in deep water or I think about deep water, ugh, I would just vom. Bit grim, I know, but I would. And I remember one time, I think my dad just lost patience for it, and I think I was just thinking about it, like in my room, and I remember throwing up, and I remember my dad being like, "Oh, clean yourself up." Like rather than him cleaning me up, he just asked me to clean myself up. And I remember thinking, gosh, is this neglect? Like I've been through so much. Like I started to become a bit of a victim because of this one situation, forgetting all the other situations where there had been a level of care. Um, and actually, when I was feeling sick this time around, I had the same feeling I had when I was experiencing that sickness of like, oh, I wish someone would take care of me. Like when that situation happened where I had a flashback to the movie Jaws and I threw up, I remember thinking so vividly, I'm sure I was like between 10 and 12, but I remember thinking, oh, I wish someone would clean me up. I wish someone would cook for me. I just really wanted nurture at that time. And that is exactly how I felt the last 2 months maybe, where I was like, I really want nurture, I really want care. And so it's quite a regress thought. And actually, when I was then journaling, I started thinking, oh, is that actually what I want? Or have I just related being sick to needing care, needing someone to take care of me? Now, as an adult, when I had that tonsillitis, I can take care of myself. Is it nice to be care of by another person? 100%. But I can take care of myself. And if I keep my brain thinking, oh, well, you need it, which at 10 or 12, I probably needed it, then I will remain regressed. Like I will never fully process and potentially wouldn't move on. And I think this is what therapy serves to do. It's not about keeping you in the past, it's about going to what happened in the past, processing, healing it, allowing the emotions from that space, and then bringing you back to the present. This is even the whole thing with mindfulness. You know, one of the best things to do if you feel anxious and you're always projecting to the future, because anxiety is about the future, right? It's a fear of the future, it's a fear of what might come to pass. And a lot of our depression is actually because of the past, but a lot of us aren't often present. We're not in the present moment. We're not present with our own bodies. And so things like mindfulness are so helpful to bring us back so we can actually live our lives. Or things like going on a color walk. I love the idea of a color walk where you tell yourself, do you know what? For the next 15 minutes. Let's do a really short walk. I'm going to go out and I'm going to intentionally notice everything that is the color red. Maybe you can take pictures of it. But what this does is it takes you from being in your brain where you're ruminating about the past or thinking and worrying about the future to actually just being present. In that time, you can engage with your body and your mind as opposed to disengaging or being disembodied or even being dissociated. I find it really helpful for those who experience maladaptive daydreaming to bring them back to the present, or people who experience anxiety. You might ask them to get back in touch with their senses because that brings you back into the present. And one of the perfect things we're doing in healing, one of the helpful things we're trying to do in therapy in order to achieve our healing is we're trying to bring you back to the present, not keep you in the past and keep you as a perpetual victim. Absolutely not. But taking time for you to go back to the past, process what needs to be processed, and bring yourself back to the future in a way that you can engage with the present healthily, not with the old defense mechanisms that didn't serve you, not with the old perspectives that didn't serve you, not with projection of how you experienced others treating you and assuming everyone's going to treat you that way. No, that's not the case. You might have been a victim in the past, but that doesn't mean you are one now. And it's important for us to acknowledge what is actually true right now. I often say to clients, what happened to you, we need to feel deep compassion for it, right? Like I don't want anyone to hate themselves into healing. I don't actually think that works. And I think because therapists lean with compassion, I think this is why people assume that we are just trying to get people to wallow in their own self-pity. That is not the case, but self-compassion is important. If self-hatred had worked, you would be healed by now. Like if your own negative inner critic had been helpful, you would not be in therapy with me. You would not be watching this pod, maybe, or you would just be feeling more healed. The things and the strategies you've had in the past may have served you in the past, but may not help right now. And that's often what people end up coming to therapy to explore of why am I a people pleaser? And actually, what often happens with people pleasing is when we go back to what might have happened. So, a very typical story of a people pleaser is perhaps they had a parent or guardian who just did not embrace them. And I know already some of you are like, what do you mean didn't embrace them? Like, I'm sure you were loved, I'm sure you were fed, I'm sure you had your needs. But children need to be embraced as they are, not because of what they do, but as they are, especially when you're young. And when you have a parent or guardian who doesn't necessarily allow space for you to just show up as you are, perhaps they'll say you're too loud. Perhaps you're playing too loud. Perhaps they're frustrated about you crying. Perhaps they're frustrated about you soiling yourself or they're frustrated about you being sick. Well, the thing is those are very normal and age appropriate things for a child to be doing or experiencing. And when the adult in your life shows frustration, how a child might perceive this, because you got to remember your brain as a child wasn't processing things as the adult brain does. It was still developing. So, as a child, the way you interpret things and the way you understand things is far more simplistic. And for a lot of us, if that was our situation where our parents just made us feel a bit too much, to be honest, too loud, too quiet, taking up too much space, maybe children are to be seen and not heard, then we interpreted that as rejection and we interpreted that as a loss of love or care. And so then what we learned to do is we kind of learned to shape shift and we learned that, well, if they've said I'm too loud and that makes them angry, then I'm just going to be really quiet because that will make them happy. And that, in a sense, is people pleasing. It's not the same. It doesn't manifest the same as when you're 25 and you're people pleasing. But at that time, that's what you learn to do. I would say people pleasing is when you are denying what is true for you, denying what feels right for you in the moment for the sake of doing something that you know will be approved by the other. And that's what a lot of us did in our development. And so when that is your story, it's really important for us to go back and be like, do you know what? Gosh, as a child, of course that makes sense. That is how you interpreted it. Like, oh, we do need to have compassion, not because you've lived that life for the last 20, 30, 40 years, but at that time, my goodness, of course, that's something that's quite sad. And when we lean into compassion there, that's not wallowing. that is appropriate when adults are speaking about some of the things that children experience. That's very appropriate. What that does is it allows you and your body to be like, oh, actually, what I felt was normal. Like I said, some of those things are very age appropriate. No one should be shamed for crying when they are a baby. That's what babies do. You know, children, I personally think, and maybe this is controversial, I find it really interesting when children might fail an exam, or they might have a tough time in school, or they might not know something and their parent meets them with anger. Because I think, well, children are learning. Like, and it's the parents and the guardians and the adults in their life's job to teach them these things. When children get things wrong, it's because they're learning. It's because it's their first time on the planet. It's because their brain is still developing. And actually, I think, and I never use good and bad as words because I think they're far too binary. But I think a good enough parent is someone who, if their child is struggling with education, they try and help assist their child to learn. And sometimes that means getting them diagnosed with or assessed for something like a dyslexia. Sometimes that means sitting with your child and doing the homework with them just so they can. Process out loud and learn how to answer the questions. Sometimes if you have the funds, and I know that requires a level of privilege financially, it's getting them a tutor, but it's meeting them with compassion. That notice that's so different from just saying, "Oh, why do you always get things wrong?" That lacks compassion completely, and that also is so unfair given that the child is just learning. Of course, it's different. If the child has been through tutoring for the last 4 years and they still can't grasp a certain thing, I can understand that there might be frustration that is appropriate for the parent because they're like, oh, I've spent loads of money on this. I understand that. But my question then would still be, does the child need to know that you're frustrated about this? Because some things, unfortunately, some of us experienced, we should have never known how our parents were feeling. Our parents had a right to feel that, and I think that's totally fine, but they shouldn't have ever told you. Because what I find happens in the therapy room is people will come in and they'll say, "Oh, well, I was a really noisy child, or I was a really messy child, I was a really annoying teenager, and I knew my parents tried their best." And I would ask, "How do you know your parents tried their best?" And they'll say, "Well, they told me they were doing everything. They told me about all the things they've done for me, and done to make sure my life was great." And I think I love that you can have that perspective now as an adult. As a child, you should have never been privy to just how much sacrifice. It is a parent's role to care and nurture and guide the child. It's a parent's role to meet the needs of a child because someone's got to. That's part of healthy development physically, psychologically. And unfortunately, where that need isn't met, that can then lead to us continuing cycles of neglect of ourselves. Continuing cycles of things like poor hygiene can come from where your parent didn't teach you how to have good hygiene. It can come from where parents might have neglected your physical needs and teaching you about puberty and sweat and all these things. We can continue patterns simply because we were never taught or we were never shown. Sometimes teaching wasn't necessarily verbal, it was just having a healthy mirror. And that's the case for a lot of us with with our emotions and how we process them. A lot of how we learn to regulate our emotions isn't about someone telling us how to experience our emotions, it's about being shown these things. And so, what I'm trying to say is, therapy is so important because we can go back. And when we go back, we can have context as to why this habit was ever started, why this defense mechanism that now feels completely unhelpful. Because at 3, if it felt like your parent was rejecting you because you were too loud, you learned to be quiet, that was really helpful. However, at 23, when you are now going into the job market and needing to do interviews, it can feel really unhelpful that you are trying to mold yourself so much. Or when you're trying to make friends, it can feel really unhelpful and quite lonely. When you're trying to meet people, it feels like no one actually knows you. Why? Because you show up as a different version of yourself to each person because you hope that they will like that version. Or at times, you don't even show up as a different version of yourself. You just show up as a different person in order for them to like you. And so it's helpful for us to go back to realize the context, to process the context in order to then get you to the future to ask the question, is this still needed now? To give your brain another option, to create a new neuro pathway. Our brains go to what's familiar. That's just how they work. And unfortunately for some of us, familiarity has not been beneficial. Even though it's comfortable, it's not beneficial. And what therapy does is it kind of provides this space for us to be like, right, it's comfortable, but is there another option? Is there something else that we can do? Is there another way that we can process? And that is not toxic positivity. Again, therapy is definitely not just being like, I'm perfect, I'm beautiful, I'm lovely. Therapy is going back to some of the toughest stuff, some of the things that your brain has blacked out for you, the things that you don't even fully remember until a therapist helps bring that into the light so you can heal it. Some of the feelings that you have been avoiding for years. Like it's quite difficult. I think mental toughness is underrated. Physical toughness, I get it. We all love it. Everyone's doing high rocks. We don't talk a lot about mental toughness, and actually, I think therapy can be one of the bravest things people do if they really allow themselves to engage in it. Not just expect someone to do all the work for them. It can be really powerful. And so once you're able to do that and give your brain a new option, rather than saying everything's going to be perfect, if you're someone who catastrophizes, your brain often thinks the worst case scenario is going to happen. Your brain probably thinks, oh, if I like maybe a child's mind might work. If I step on a crack, I'll break my mother's back. That's that old saying. Let's use that. Um, your brain might naturally catastrophize because that's what's comfortable, that's what it's always done, that's the pattern it's familiar with. But when we have time and to explore the origins, to process the origins, what we do is we can bring it to the future and we can say, okay, what is the new option I can give my brain? So I can start conditioning myself to know that I don't have to do what has always worked for me. And that might not be, oh, well, I'm going to step on every crack. That means my mum will be fine. We don't have to go the complete other way. The pendulum doesn't have to swing the complete other way. We can find a bit of gray space, a bit of liminal space. In the same way, if you're someone who has a really harsh inner critic, like, if you're someone who really does not like themselves, who thinks that you are ugly, or you think that your body is just not great, not nice, if you think that you don't have skills, or maybe you just feel a lack of confidence in another area, what I often say to the clients I work with is, I don't want us to come up with a new statement or an affirmation that is completely contrary to that. I don't want people, if they feel ugly, what I don't want you to do is leave the session and be like, I'm so beautiful, I'm so beautiful, because your brain will just process that as a lie. Like, as much as we can try and gaslight ourselves, for some of us that doesn't work. But if we move from saying I'm so ugly to I'm okay, our brain can comprehend that. Our brain doesn't necessarily reject that as much, it doesn't create as much inner conflict. Even just that perspective shift of, rather than me being ugly, I'm okay. Or rather than me being ugly, maybe some people think I'm ugly, but not everyone. Just that middle ground can bring so much peace to us, because that stops us from spiraling and ruminating and hating ourselves more, but also it creates a new pathway for our brain. And eventually, over time, if we can then start living in that truth of, maybe I'm not ugly all the time, maybe I'm just ugly in the mornings, or maybe I'm okay, that can create so much freedom. That can bring so much healing. It sounds so simple, but it really can. If you're someone who's been struggling because you're like, my affirmations just aren't working. Yes, you can try and stick it out longer, but sometimes it doesn't work. So rather than saying something that feels so untrue, let's find a middle ground perspective. Let's find that gray space. Not everything has to be so black and white. And unfortunately, in life, I think we like to operate in black and white, so quite binary, because as humans we like to understand things, and so create that gray space, and it can actually provide a lot of freedom. It also can provide a lot of space. I'm using the word provide, but it can create a lot of space for you to dream for where you want to be, or for you to just have hope for something different, as opposed to despair in what things have been. And so, all this to say, my take on therapy is it's not just creating perpetual victims, at least not therapy with me. Maybe therapy with other people. I know sometimes people have really difficult experiences of therapy and really unhelpful experiences of therapy. I would never want to minimize that that is some people's experience. But when you find a therapist who really helps you to dig deeper and to sometimes delve into some of that deeper stuff at the appropriate time, because at times it's not always appropriate. When you find someone who can help you dig into those deeper places and help you ask the questions like, does this even serve me anymore? Is this thing beneficial to me anymore? Where is self compassion appropriate? And where is a bit of tough love appropriate? I can have self compassion for myself in the sense that I might think, oh, do you know what? My poor body image started at 21. Let's say that I had really bad body image at 21, and that's because at uni I started binge eating. let's let's use this example. Uni, I started binge eating and it really affected my self-confidence. That's quite a common story. What's it called? The freshman 15, where people go to college and they gain some weight because they finally have their own money or a loan of sorts and they can eat what they want and perhaps they don't know how to create and make nutritious meals. And so my my body image might have changed. Maybe I started to dislike my body and what it shifted to be like. Maybe puberty made me dislike how I had developed. Um, Compassion is really important there. But if I also have a goal, and it's so personal, some people, they go to college, they fully develop, and they realize, I love this. Like, power to them. I think that's incredible. But some people, they go and perhaps they might gain weight or lose a lot of weight, and they think, oh no, I want my body to look different. I want to be toned. I want to be strong. I want to be thicker. I want to be slimmer. Whatever. Everyone's on Ozempic these days, so I imagine if I ask most people now, they'd say, I want to be skinny. Well, that's where tough love is sometimes needed, right? That's where we can say, okay, I have compassion because this is where this thing started. And I get that that's why I feel this way about my body. But how do I love myself and be disciplined enough? Because I think self-love and self-respect go hand in hand. And I don't think the internet talks about that enough. Because self-respect will lead you to be disciplined. Self-love alone isn't just affirmations. It also is at times getting up when you don't want to go to the gym. At times it is eating the salad, even if you'd rather eat the sticky toffee pudding. Like I love an SDP personally, but I know it's not always beneficial. And so it's important for therapy to not just be sitting and moping in our feelings. It's also important for therapy to be tough, for it to be times where you're challenging your thoughts and you're challenging your inner critic in order to heal. And so that's my stance on therapy. I mean, love it or hate it, that's totally fine. But it's worked for the people I've worked with, and it's worked for me. That's what I took from my own therapy journey with Oscar. I felt like he was tough but fair, and I think his compassion was appropriate at times, and I think his discipline or rebuke was appropriate at times. And I think that's what good therapy looks like. So hopefully that's helped you get a better understanding. And if you do want to look into therapy, those websites I mentioned before, I can link them in my bio, things like Counseling Directory or the BACP website are really helpful. And I know there's a lot of people who feel a lot of fear of finding a therapist just because there's so many people online. Often the directories are really helpful because those are people who are qualified, who have to work in accordance to the governing body. And yeah, have a good time. Look at those. If you want therapy, have a look at those. But anyway, I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye.